Good morning, good evening, good night to everyone. My name is Martina Grom. I'm an Azure and Microsoft 365 MVP. Today, I'm presenting my second session today at Mac Conference and my second remote session. So my first Mac Conference was back in Austin, Texas. And I would really love to see many of you in person, and hopefully we will see each other soon. Today's session is around how we can automate Exchange Online at scale. And also we want to share some lessons learned from large environments. As I said already, my name is Martina Grom. I'm the CEO of At Work. We are based in Vienna, Austria, so it's in the evening right now for us. And I'm here together with my colleague, Toni.
Hello, everyone. My name is Toni Pohl. I'm an IT consultant, similar like Martina. I'm specialized in designing solutions for Microsoft 365 with Microsoft Azure. So I'm an Azure guy, and I think and I hope I can show you a lot of information, a lot of tips how you can automate Exchange Online at scale with various technologies.
So what we will do today in this session is, it's kind of, and everybody knows that who does Exchange since quite a while, is if you're doing a task more than twice, you should automate it. And there are four main things what drives automations. So first of all, we want to simplify things. We want to reduce complexity out of the tasks. So this is the one and number one rule. The second one for me is standardization. So we need to standardize whenever possible, because the more we standardize, the less work we have and the more we can automate. Also, if we look at repetition, if the task doesn't have high degree of variations, you need to make it automated and repeated automatically, because we have many things to do which are manual tasks and so on, and everything what could be automated should be automated. Also, the last part is the business need. What's the impact and improvement for the users if things work in an automated way? Today's agenda is, first of all, we want to show you how we can automate your tasks in Exchange Online with automation tasks. Then we will for sure look into Azure Logic Apps. It's one of our favorite topics. It's all around Azure, all around Logic Apps. We use that all the time in our applications and so on. Toni will also show you how you can work with an automation account. My part is more the security and compliance part. So we will also look at how we can secure your credentials and connections, because we need to do that, especially if we go into automation a lot. And then we will see how do we get the monitoring out of that with log analytics and alerts. And then the last point here is how we can share lessons learned in large environments from the applications we build for our customers.
So when talking about automation, we have various technical services we can use. So we need to identify what kind of solution do I need, or what kind of technology fits to the solution, to the business case I want to solve here. And of course, there are many various topics, various services Azure provides us. So typical workloads, for example, are often things like PowerShell scripts. I want to create a new team, for example, and I have a business process which accomplishes that request from a user, eventually with an approval process behind. Or eventually I have a virtual machine which runs as a kind of, we know that from various companies, as a batch server, which now can be easily accomplished now with Azure automation accounts. And of course, we have APIs or web applications or Azure functions that solve a small part in a larger business process. So we have various technologies. Again, what Martina mentioned, we like to use Logic Apps for small things, and we like to use automation accounts. And of course, we also develop our own solutions, which are the larger business processes in many cases. But for many use cases, like similar like the Power Platform, is a solution for most use cases. And it's similar here also for automating Exchange.
And also, if you think about how we work, Microsoft 365 is a SaaS service. and also think about going into PaaS in the automation case. Just a lift and shift provisioning in EIS is not our preferred method to do there because we do not want to patch machines anymore. So we love PaaS, and this is also one of the considerations you have if you design a new application.
PaaS for the world.
Yes.
So we will dive into Azure Logic Apps or Power Automate, which is more or less the same, the small and the bigger brother, as we often call it. We will look into automation accounts, and we will look into security. We will create our own certificate to ensure that we connect with modern authentication against our endpoints, against Exchange, for example. And of course, there are a lot of other things, what I already mentioned before, like functions, APIs, and so on.
So first of all, I think we all are aware of a specific deadline which will come in October. Basic Auth is going away finally, and I hope this time it's meant that way. So always think about modern authentication. So modern authentication is, from an authentication point of view, it's the basic of all services. And also Azure Active Directory is the basis for everything. And for using in an enterprise app, we use modern authentication through an Azure app.
Exactly. So this is just a very small, from a bird's eye view, what is modern authentication? Well, it's a specific authorization protocol, and the process is that I have an application that is registered in Azure Active Directory. That's the Microsoft Identity Platform, and I need to authenticate as a user, as a device, or as an application. And as we know, as a user usually needs to have a multi-factor configured and so on. So there are some things which we need to solve to automate things, to automate processes. And the part that's important here is to understand how this authentication works and what kind of flows we can use. And I want to show you that in a demo here with that bearer token we see here in this graphics here. How does this look like? So now let's start with my Azure portal here. So this is a demo tenant here. I'm logged in here, and I go to Azure Active Directory, and I want to create a new application because I want to use that application to authenticate. Basically, that's a very simple thing here. I can see, first of all my applications here, or all applications, and I can create a new application, a new registration for an application. So I call this my Mac app, for example. And here I decide, okay, who is able to use this application? Only users or applications in my single tenant, or is it an application that can be used in a multi-tenant environment, or personal accounts and so on. So in many cases, I would simply create an application for my application. If it's a web application, something with an interaction, I would add a redirect URI. I don't do that right now. I simply create this application in our environment, in our tenant here. So I click register here. And now I need to do actually only two things. I get an application client ID, which is this one. So I simply copy that, and I take a note of that in my notepad here. So I simply paste it here. That's my application ID. That's my tenant ID. So I also copy that here. And the last part, eventually I put the tenant ID here on top. And the last part here is how do I authenticate? Well, I can do this with secrets, which is a password, or with certificates. We come to the certificates a little bit later because we need to authenticate against Exchange Online later here. So just for a demo here, I create a new password, which is a secret, which is valid for just 6 months here. And I create that secret here, and I copy that value here into my notepad. So that would be my secret. So now I can authenticate with this application and a user or an application, but I need to have access to specific resources in the cloud. You can see by default, I only get the user.read permission, which says I'm allowed to read my own profile. But if I want to do something else, like, for example, I want to use Microsoft Graph or Exchange Online services to do something in that tenant, I would say I want to use Microsoft Graph as a resource provider. And now I decide, do I want to have an interactive login, which is a delegated permission, or do I want to have an application permission? In my case, I want to use this application in a PowerShell script to do something in my tenant. So I select application permission, and then I search, let's say for user, for example, I want to be able to read all users in that Active Directory, and I search for groups, for example. And I also want to be able to read all groups, which includes Microsoft Teams and Microsoft 365 groups. So group read all. Eventually, my application is also used to create a new team. So I would select this one here as well. So these are the permissions which I select for my application. You can see that's not granted. So I go as a global administrator. I can say, I trust this application I just created. I grant the admin consent here, and this is it. So now I have an application which I can use to log in. So how does the modern authentication process work? So let's go to my Visual Studio here. And here you can see I have such a small demo here. So I simply take these values here and use them here. So this is the tenant ID here, which is the same. So I can remove this one here. This is my application ID. So let's remove this one or replace this one here. And this is the secret for my application here. So I create variables for that with these values, and then I've created a small function, initialize authorization. I want to have access to Microsoft Graph, and here's my login process. That's where I get my token here for that tenant, and then I simply ask for the token which I get here with the authorization result, and say, okay, this is now my authorization, which I can use to do something in that tenant here. What I else do in here is I write that result I get into a file here just to show you how this looks like. So I save this here. And now let's run this very small PowerShell script. And if it works, we should get back a result here, which says the authorization. And we got a token here. And that token here can be used for doing something. To simply show you what's in the token, let's simply take that and paste it into my browser. And there's a website that's called job.ms, which analyzes this token, which decodes that token here, which is this one. And I simply take that token and paste it in here. Please don't do that with productive tenants. It's just for development purposes to understand what's happening behind the scenes when I authenticate against Microsoft Graph in that case. And you can see the decoded token here that says, well, we have some expressions here, like how long is it valid. But the important part here is, first of all, I see who is the audience, what can I access with that token, who issued that token, the security token service from Windows here. Here's my display name, my Mac app, and these are the permissions which this token provides. So this token says, well, with this application, you're allowed, you get the role for reading groups, creating groups, and reading users. And there's some more information here, like if I click on the claims here, I get also the decoded part here that says, well, that token was issued right now at this time. So that's my time here in Central Europe, that's 6:07. And how long is the token valid, the expiration here? And you can see it's valid for 1 hour. If the token expires, I could use the refresh token to get the new token to do something in that tenant. So that's the basic idea of the modern authentication, how we can use this for our own purposes to say we want to do something with that here. Okay, once I'm authenticated, let's go back to my Azure portal here. What can I do here? Well, we have two services we can use for small automation things. So for example, here's a logic app, which also could be a flow here. And logic apps or flows are using connectors, and the connectors always authenticate with a user account, but can also use other accounts as well. So let me show you this small logic app here. That's part of a business process to automate specific things like, for example, sending an actionable message card to a user to say, what kind of lunch do you want to have today? Just to show any process here. We want to send the user the information. what do you want to have for lunch? And the user gets a message in Outlook or Teams or whatever, and he decides and we want to do something with that reaction. It could be also an approval process or something like this. The important part here is we are using Microsoft Graph to do this. So we can see this is an endpoint where I say, I want to use Microsoft Graph and I want to send an email, which is the method here, from a specific mailbox. That could be a shared mailbox, that could be any other service account mailbox, something which I'm using for my business process. Then I say I send a specific message. In that case, it's an email or an adaptive card or something. And here's the interesting part here, the manage identity, or the method, how do I authenticate? Let me, before we run this, let me just duplicate this tab here. And I want to show you the process, how we authenticate as an application, because I already prepared that here as well. So if I go to the logic apps, I have one with a higher number, which is this one here, Graph Send. This is the it's using the authentication with an application and a secret. So you can see this action here does the same thing. It sends a message here, and the content type is application JSON. The important part here I selected authenticate with Azure Active Directory OAuth. So here I'm saying the authentity who issued the token is loginmicrosoft.com. The tenant ID is this one. And here you can see the audience. I want to access Microsoft Graph with that here. This is my application ID and this is my secret. Of course, that secret, if you really use it in that way, should always come from a key vault. And you can use managed identity to access the key vault in that process, but just to show you how you can access that here. So if I run this here, I run this trigger here, we should see that this simple business process, in that case, that logic app here, is running. And what's happening, I'm sending an email, in that case, to myself. So it should be in here. So that's the email address I'm using here, Toni TPE5 something. And you can see I have Outlook open here. So this is the email I just sent from that logic app. And the authorization here was done with an application and the secret just as I created it. So in logic app, it's in most cases very simple to use them. You don't have to take care of authenticating as a user, or you don't have to take care of that process yourself, what we did before with PowerShell, but you can use it simply out of the box with the connector, in that case with the HTTP connector. If I do something else, like for example, doing something in a storage table or whatever is part of that business process, you can also select what kind of connection do you want to use to access that resource here. In that case, that's an Azure Storage account. So I authenticated here with that connection here, which is in the API connections of that logic app here. So it always depends on the connector, what the connector understands and what kind of authentication the connector provides here. So that's more or less the simple method, how you can use these logic apps here. What I did here in this actionable message here, I authenticated as a managed identity. And this is a recommendation I have for running most of the automation accounts or most of the automation processes, to say, I don't authenticate as an application a secret, but I'm using an application or a certificate. Or the best case, I'm using a managed identity, because that managed identity cannot leave Azure.
This was also one of the questions. So this is the recommended way, not to use client secrets or post them to Notepad on a recorded video. Right?
Right. Absolutely. By the way, if you're using logic apps here, there's one feature here to obfuscate the data here, secure outputs, secure inputs. That's nice, because then in the flow, you don't see the secret itself. You just see the obfuscation here. That's not really a good protection, but it's just for the logs, for example. So I'm, for example, using log analytics. We come to that maybe a little bit later, when we see what was successful, which business process did run, and which business process didn't run. Okay, so in that case, let's run this message here with a managed identity. Let's see what it does. So in that case, we see the process here also generates an email. In that case, that email contains an actionable message here. And here we see that I got an email here, and this is the process we are showing here. That's just an adaptive card that asks me, what do you want to have for menu? It could be anything. In my case, I say I want to have the schnitzel with a lot of potatoes or whatever, and I say I select this one, and now we have another logic app that reacts on that result here, stores that result into an Azure storage account, and gives me back another actionable message that says, okay, thank you for choosing, in that case, menu 1. So this is a typical process in many organizations. You can cover many use cases with such a simple logic app. In that case, we customize that logic app here to do something. The important part, what I want to point out here, is that we have this managed identity in place. How can we use that? Well, if we create in that case, a logic app or an automation account or many other Azure resources, we have something that's called identity. Which identity can be used for this specific resource here. So if I click on the identity for that logic app here, we see that this is switched on. This is the object principal ID, which means that's another application in our Azure Active Directory. So I can, in that case, we see that's one sent actionable message, and that's B9A something. If I go to my Azure Active Directory, and to my enterprise applications, you can filter here for managed identities, for example. Then you see every managed identity in reality is also an application in our Azure Active Directory. But the benefit is that this managed identity, I don't have to do something, I simply can use it. But if you want to use it, what I'm doing here in this logic app here, I'm also using that managed identity to write data to an Azure storage account, for example. So let's go back to the application. We see that this application is somewhere here. That's the managed identity for this specific resource here. And we see that the permissions for that actionable messages, Microsoft Graph made sense. So I added this permission to this managed identity to say, I want to use this managed identity to access Microsoft Graph to send an email, for example, what we did here in this logic app here. So let's go back to our logic app, which is this one here, send actionable message, and to the flow, what's happening in that process here. So we see that in that case, for example, we are using such a managed identity to write data to a storage account. The storage account, by the way, is this one here, this table messages, where every time I give an answer, I select an option, we write something back to this database. So how do we access that storage here? We don't do it with an access key or something. That identity only stays in Azure Active Directory itself. We need to go to the storage account here, in that case here, that's my Mac 22, and I need to enable the access for this specific application. The same thing what we've seen before with Microsoft Graph, where I said, with Microsoft Graph, with this application, I want to be able to send a message, auto-create, or read a user or something like this. So if I go to the role assignment of that object here, we should see that we have this application here in 3 permissions. We have it. We need it only for 2 permissions, which is the reader here, one send actionable message, and we need to have that permission storage table data contributor to be able to read and write data to that storage. So it always depends on the resource itself, how I define the permissions. And the same goes here for key vaults, for example. So I have a key vault which stores secrets for me. And if I go to the access policies of that key vault, you will see there's also one application that's called MacDemo that has permissions to read keys and secrets and certificates, for example. So it's always the same principle. I need to take care that my application, whatever it is, if it's a managed identity, or if it's a user, or if it's an application itself, has access to these resources I want to access. So I just want to point that out because from my perspective, it's very important to take care of security when you create business processes. Talking about managed identities, there are 2 types, which I also want to point out here. There's system-assigned managed identities, which means that's an automatically created managed identity, which is just an ID in Azure Active Directory that lives with that resource. So if I create a logic app and enable the system-assigned managed identity, I get one identity just for this one logic app. The other way around would be I have, let's say, 10 logic apps or 10 other processes that need to have access to Microsoft Graph to send an email to create a team or something like this, then I would create a user-assigned managed identity, which means this works more or less in the same way as a user object. So managed identities, here it is. I could also create such a user, and then I can say, if I select one of these users here, like user 3, for example, you will see in the managed identities that this user here also has a client ID, which is the application ID. In that case, it would be this one. And then I could enable permissions for that specific user to access specific resources. Although this might be a little bit Azure, a lot of Azure, it's really important if you want to automate something, take care of the resources and of the permissions you're using and use modern authentication. With that, I want to come to Azure Automation Actions. So now we come to the business processes where we say we want to do something that happens within a business process. That can be a logic app or it can be an automation account here. And automation accounts are very interesting, especially for IT administrators, because they allow me to use PowerShell scripts. So the typical users of such automation accounts are developers for small purposes, typically IT administrators, especially Exchange administrators. And of course, I can also integrate such automation accounts in other business processes as well. And I want to show you that how we can do that to automate things here. So we want to access Exchange Online, we want to access Teams, etc. So let's go to our automation accounts here. And I have one automation account created. Again, this automation account also, as almost all service resources in Azure, have an identity. By default, they are switched on. So I can create that automation account here with that object principal ID, for example, to shut down or access a virtual machine in a specific resource group or similar. So it's always the same story here. Automation accounts are very useful because you can integrate your PowerShell modules. So I can go to Browse Gallery, for example, and I can search for Graph, for example. I want to use Microsoft Graph PowerShell module to do something in my tenant. What I usually always need is Microsoft Graph authentication. And of course, depending on what I want to access, for example, I want to create a new team, Microsoft Graph Teams, applications, and so on. You can see there are a lot of modules for Microsoft Graph, or of course, for Exchange. So for Exchange Online Management, there's also a PowerShell module which you can integrate. The idea here is, so I already did it. If I look at the modules which are already installed in that automation account, you can see I already installed the PowerShell module for Exchange Online and some modules for Graph. And you can see I used runtime version 7.1, which is PowerShell.core, to use the new PowerShell, which doesn't matter for my scripts, but I try to use the latest versions here. And everything you want to automate is done here in so-called runbooks. And I have created a runbook that's called Get Teams here. And with that Get Teams here, let's have a look what this PowerShell script does. It's very simple. It says, please authenticate with a user. Okay, that would be the username and the password, and then connect to Microsoft Teams with these credentials and give me a list of all the teams and do an output for them. We can access that data here from, if I go back to my runbook, from the credentials. So we have a built-in key vault which stores securely all our secrets. So if I go to credentials, you can see I have added an administrator of that tenant, in that case with the name username and with a password. And you can restrict when you create such a credential with a username password if that is visible or not visible. So it's very easy to add. But what's the problem here? The problem is that our user is using username and password. And in what happens if I have multi-factor authentication enabled for that user? Well, then my script simply won't work. So in my case, I haven't done that. So let's go back to our runbooks here, just to see if this basically works. So this is my script here, which we saw here. It's using that data here. I can publish this script here. And now I use this safe environment in Azure Automation accounts to run this script. While this runs here, so let's go here, start this job. You can see I need to refresh the output So when the script is running to see what's happening here, I also have error that occur or warnings, and of course logs on the exceptions and so on. So if the script runs and the authentication with the username and password works, I should see a list of teams. So in the meantime, while this runs here, just want to show you one thing here, how these automation accounts work. They're very useful for running PowerShell scripts in a safe environment. So we have runbooks, which are our scripts here, and we have things like shared modules or variables, and we have secrets like a username, a password, a certificate, and so on. And this package, when I run it, is it's put into a package, and that package is then deployed to a virtual machine, which runs that code and gives me the output. So that's the basic idea of automation accounts. So whenever you have a batch server or run something on your local machine, please move it to an Azure automation account. In that case, it worked perfectly. We see that we could authenticate, and we got a list of some teams here of that tenant. Okay, that's nice. So what can I do with such a functionality? So for example, I can create a new team here. So here's a PowerShell script that does the same thing. We can, by the way, we can access that here by going to the credentials and say, okay, these are the credentials which are stored in that automation account. I can say, please give me that, which I did here. I put it into an object credentials, and then I can authenticate with these credentials against, in that case, Microsoft Teams, because I added that PowerShell module. And here you can see I am doing some things like I create a new team with the Teams commandlet. I add some owners, I add some users, I add some channels to that. So let's publish this script here and simply run it so that you see how it works with parameters. If I have parameters here, then I'm going to run it interactively, not from a webhook or so. I say, okay, I create a new team, let's call it team 20, and the owner should be the default parameter, so I simply run this script here. This will take a moment, and while this runs here, the idea is to secure our credentials here. So you can see we can use Microsoft or we can use PowerShell to do things in here. A nice thing what you also can do, we can use webhooks. So we can attach a webhook to a runbook. So for example, I can go here. You can see I already did it. I can add a new webhook, give the webhook a name, say that's my A2 test, whatever. This webhook is valid for, let's say, 2 weeks or so, and that would be the endpoint, the URL, which I can use from PowerShell script, from Azure Logic Apps, from a flow, from something, depending if I have a premium connector or not, to run this script here to do something. So that's very nice. And what I also can do here, I can schedule a task, which means I want this script to run automatically at a specific time. That would be this one here. I can say I add a schedule every Monday at 6 o'clock in the morning, run this script here. Okay, let's have a look back to the, actually we've been here in A2 create team. Let's see how this goes. It's still running. So let's see what the output is. We see we already got some data, new team. Let's go to my teams here. Oh, here it is. You can see I just got it at the right moment. That team 20 has been created and some channels have been automatically created here. So this is what you can do with such automation accounts. So that's very useful. But now we want to take another step. We want to move forward with our security. So how can we authenticate, for example, against Exchange Online? So that's another step. And here I want to go back to my presentation. To secure that, that's the next section. We want to use authentication with an Azure application app and a certificate. So we no longer trust our username and password. We want to authenticate in a modern way. So first of all, we need an application, and that application must have access to Exchange Manage as app. So let me show you what I mean by that. So I go back to my Azure Active Directory and to my applications somewhere here. And I created a new application, My Mac App. This is what we started here at the beginning of our session. And we said, well, we are authenticating with an application and a secret. This worked very well. But we now want to access Microsoft Exchange. So usually you would expect I go to the permissions and you search for Exchange Management in here. But unfortunately, that resource provider isn't listed in here. Of course, there are other tabs here, like applications you register for your organization. If I search for Exchange, there are also no results, and I haven't registered any own APIs. There's one Azure function which I added here. So Exchange management isn't here. So I cannot, let's say, get an Exchange mailbox or so, because it's simply not available. And for that, you need to do one specific thing. If you say, I want to have an application with access to Exchange, I need to add that role manually. So I go to the manifest of that application, which is a big JSON file here. And here you can see here the resource providers, what I can do with that application. So that's more or less what falls out of my wizard if I add a permission and if I grant a permission for a specific resource here. So what I would need to do, I go back to my presentation here, which is this one, and I simply paste this here, or I copy it and add it to my resources, which should be resource access. I think it should be here. The next resource provider. Let's see if this works. That's my, oops, that's a little bit too much. So actually it should be this one here. So I add the resource provider for Exchange management with a specific role. Let's see if it works. Obviously I have a typo in here somewhere. So my JSON doesn't seem to be correct here, because my save button here is inactive. But let me check with another application. I think it was this one here, where I added this resource provider, or maybe a different one. I think it was this one here. Yeah, when you do it correctly, let's look at the manifest here. So what I wanted to show you, I added this one here, this section here, where I say, this is the Exchange provider, this is the role. And if you add that to the manifest and I go to the API permission, you see you get that resource provider and you get full access as an application to use Exchange, in that case, web services, for example. So there is a solution for such use cases where I say, I want to access a specific resource that's eventually not in the list of the API permissions here. And then you can see I granted that application permission here. So that's one thing. The next thing, what you can do here, you can add a certificate. And the certificate can be stored in the key vault of the automation account here. And you can create such an own certificate. Let me show you how I can do that and how we can use that. So let's go to our get mailbox with a certificate. How would we use that? Well, we can use that by using a connection with the certificate in that automation account here. So you can see I'm using Connect Exchange Online, and here I'm using a certificate thumbprint and an application ID and an organization to do something, and then I get the mail. I'm connected with that method, no user, no password, simply using application and certificate here. So going back here, what the certificate, which is the my Mac auth cert, and I want to show you how we can do this here. So I'm using my management console and I'm using PowerShell, so which opens here. I can go here and add the certificate, snap in for my user account. And I can use PowerShell, and I created a new certificate in here, which is this one here, my Mac auth cert. And you can do this very easily with this PowerShell script. I don't do that right now, but this is the code where I can simply run this and say, I create a new self-signed certificate, which is valid for 3 years, 5 years, give it a name and say, please store it in my current user, my store. And you get this certificate with that PowerShell script, and then you can simply go here and say, I export this data as a with private key and without private key. And what you get then is the two certificates, and these certificates you can use and upload here. So if I go to certificates and I say add a certificate, I would say that's my test certificate, and here would be in that case, the file with the private key. So I go here let's see, I think I have it still in my downloads directory. Here it is. And I say, this is my private key certificate, including the private key, which I think in this case here is the same name. It's stored in that file, so I just have to paste that from my Active Directory or from somewhere. So that would be the password for that. Is it exportable or not? So that would be step 1 here. And the second thing, now I have the certificate imported to my Azure Automation account. The second thing, I would go to the application and upload the second part here, go to certificates, upload the certificate, and do the same thing with the file with the public key, in that case, this one here, and add it to this application. So let's add this to the application. So these are the 2 parts here. I also have a thumbprint, and the last part here, if I want to use it, I created a new connection. Again, everything in here in the shared resources is stored in a key vault that's behind that automation account here. I added a new Exchange connection and said, that's my application ID, that's my tenant, that's my certificate thumbprint, and subscription I simply didn't use. And this is what I'm using in the script itself. So let's go back to our runbooks here and see what happened if I went here, or when I went here. So let's see when the last one happened, which eventually was this one. And we could see that this one did work. It authenticated me with the application, with the certificate I created, and gave me all the mailboxes of that, in that case, tenant here. So we can see the mailboxes from Adele, Alex, Andy, and so on. So that's the story, how we can use modern authentication with your own PowerShell scripts in your own environments. So just as a summary for that here, what I did with the certificate, what I showed you very quickly, I used the PFX file to include that into the Azure Automation account. This includes the private key to the certificate, and I used the public certificate to store that in the Azure application. And with that component in combination with the application ID, I can authenticate, and almost all the all the connection modules from PowerShell are able to use such a certificate. But you have to provide the right permissions for that application, of course. Okay, I have a last part here that's important for business processes. Working with log analytics, how do you know if an application did fail or was running in a correct way? So we can do this very easily with monitoring and alerting. So here's my Mac demo automation account, and what I did here, I added the diagnostic settings. So we can go in here and say, I want to be informed if something happens or what happens in that automation account or in that Azure Logic app, for example. So we can add such a diagnostic setting here and can say, we give that a name. We say, I want to have all logs and all audits, and please send them to a specific log analytics workspace, which I did here with the Mac log analytics, which is also in the same region as my automation account, of course. So let's go back to my log analytics workspaces. Here it is. That's the log space. That's also basis, for example, for Azure Sentinel and other services. So it's usually a good idea to use such a log analytics workspace to store what's happening in your resources, in your services. And here I go to logs here. And this here shows me some default queries. I simply close that, or I think I have one already here stored, which is something with failed things like this one, failed automation jobs. So load this query to the editor here, and just want to show you what I'm doing here. So first of all, I'm asking for a table that's coming from here. I'm asking for the Azure Diagnostics. And if I run this, you can see I get a lot of results. Let's make this a little bit bigger here. Azure Diagnostics shows me everything that happens, what protocols the data, what logs the data into this log analytics workspace. So you can see audit events, job streams, job logs, etc. So this is more or less the data, what's happening in behind the scene. And if you want to filter just, for example, things that happened in automation accounts, I would select the resource provider and I would say the category is job logs, and then I'm interested in everything that's failed or stopped or suspended. So let's run this here for the last 24 hours, and you can see, oh, there are two automation accounts, two scripts here that show that failed. And now I can see, okay, the runbook name, like create a new team, failed at a specific time, and then I can dive deeper into that. The benefit, just to point out that here quickly, is you can add an alert rule for that and say, hey, I want to get a notification if this job fails. And then, for example, you can send an email, you can post a message with a Logic app to a Teams channel, and so on. So that's very, very useful to keep track of your business processes you implement with Azure Logic apps or with automation accounts with PowerShell scripts. Okay, this was a lot of demo. I hope it made sense for you. We have a last part, a little bit about what we learned from deploying such solutions, and Martina will help us a little bit and guide us through that a little bit.
Yeah, and I will also wrap up the session. I saw a couple of questions in the chat. We will also answer those. So it's not about the solution itself, it's more about how we build that. So we started to build a solution which manages a single tenant and splits it into smaller parts, because this is a business requirement we got. First of all, we are using Microsoft Graph all the time, wherever we can. There are some specifics, especially around Exchange, where we do not have that because there's just no functionality available through Microsoft Graph, where we use Exchange Online PowerShell v2. And for that, we also use some SharePoint Online apps and also some REST endpoints. The learnings we had there is, first of all, out of GDPR reasons and privacy reasons, we didn't want to store a lot of content from customers in our environment. But we also learned it's you need, from a development perspective, you need to decide between real-time access and cached and data access sync. So we are syncing a couple of data just to have a better performance in our own app. Also, think about that we need to work with queues and the this is the word I can't say in English.
Methods.
Yeah, methods. So for instance, if you're building reports and so on, you do not need them to build them in real time. You can have a queue which works over time or anything else. Also, one learning was Microsoft throttles everything. So we need to have a good error handling in place and also retry functionalities, especially in large tenants. So if you are managing a tenant with 200,000 users or more users, you always need to have retries in place and also the error handling. So that means, from a development perspective, this is kind of the circle of life for every developer in an evergreen service. First of all, learn developing for the cloud, plan your flows, scripts, and so on, deploy, fail, test it with a demo tenant, fail again, redeploy, service the solution, and start from the beginning. So this is one of the lessons learned we had here. Also, we provided in the slide deck all the links Toni used in part of the demo. And also, if you want to look at how we did secure our apps with Azure and the samples, they are all available on Toni's GitHub. That being said, I would just briefly stop the presentation and that we can look at the questions we had here.
Okay, I see there are a couple of questions in here, so we try to answer them. Let's start eventually. There's a lot of chat going on in here.
So one of the questions was, are Logic apps available with a P2, or is managed identity more expensive than other clients you used an Azure subscription?
Yeah, eventually Shelley asked if Logic apps is available with a P2 subscription. The benefit in using Azure is, from my perspective, you only pay what you use, so it's not included in Microsoft 365. From my perspective, Azure Logic apps is like a kind of big brother of Power Automate, which means you could also do a lot of things with Power Automate. But Azure Logic Apps, from my perspective, are better to use for a business perspective if it's a department or a company workflow. So it's not included. It's really, you need to have an Azure subscription for that. Okay, let's have a look. And Wins ask, I know certificates have been promoted several times in various sessions. I'm still not sold on the certificate over client secrets. Okay. Can you provide any guidance or articles to help sell me on it? Well, the thing is, modern authentication, you can authenticate with an application and a secret, but you have to protect the secret. So what I showed in the beginning with accessing Microsoft Graph, from my perspective, a secret never should be in a Logic app. It always should be in a key vault. Then you're more or less safe. Using managed identity has a lot of benefits because you don't have to take care of any secrets or something. It's coming out of the box more or less. Certificates are always useful for accessing, for example, Exchange or Team or PowerShells, because the certificate, as you saw eventually, when I upload a certificate in an automation account, I can say this cannot be exported. So the certificate of security key cannot leave Azure. So that's, from my perspective, also a big benefit compared to a secret you have to an authentication for application ID and secret, because you can simply copy the secret anywhere. So certificates really have a reason, or from my perspective, is a benefit for security.
Yeah, and also there's a lot going on around certificates and the benefits around that. I hope Toni answered that. I didn't want to, I know it was a very packed session and we went very fast. I hope you still learned something and you liked it, and please come back in 1 hour. We have a third session in place where we will talk about how you can modernize your applications and moving from AWS to Microsoft Graph, obviously. So thank you all and hope to see you soon.
Thank you.